Hi and welcome to the training. My name is Jill Frederick and I'm the principal at Schultz Elementary. And today we're going to talk about backward design and what it is and why it's so important. So let's get started. So what exactly is backward design? Backward design is a method by which educators can use to plan instruction by beginning with the desired outcome first and then mapping the route to arrive there instructionally. How do you achieve your goals if you haven't identified them first? So whereas a lot of times teachers in the past or maybe even currently who haven't heard of backward design, they can tend to plan week by week, day by day even sometimes, to the detriment of the goals of the TEKS and classroom instruction. And this is the reverse of that kind of thinking. Instead of only looking ahead a little bit at a time in chunks and hoping that the instruction is fluid and that it all connects properly, you start with the end in mind and you work backwards to ensure that the instruction is purposeful and continuous and really thought out well and thoroughly. Why is backward design important? Well, although the process might take more time initially, such as in longer planning and more cohesiveness, with thoughtful planning and trained educators, which is what we're doing today, we're training all on backward design so that everyone understands all the steps and can go back to their own classroom and their own campus and teams to work together to make it happen. Instruction is sure to be more purposeful and aligned. So let's take a look at the stages of backward design. There are three main stages to the process. The first stage is to begin with the end in mind. So you need to identify what your goals are first by looking at the TEKS. And in order to do that, you would need to plan, let's say, for the 6 weeks and for the year. So for the 6 weeks to know where students need to be in that incremental amount of time, and also the end of the year to ensure that all TEKS have been taught in order for the students to move up to the next grade level fully prepared. Stage 2 is where you're going to identify how the students will demonstrate that they have mastered the concepts. In other words, what will your summative assessment or assessments look like? And lastly is where you're going to actually plan your instruction to take you through the process and to fulfill those goals. Let's look at the steps one by one to backward design. So number one, teachers begin by reviewing the TEKS the students are expected to learn in the 6 weeks and or by the end of the year. So oftentimes when we meet in our PLCs, we're going to be looking at the 6 weeks worth of TEKS and also an even larger view as in the whole year for vertical teaming and planning to know that we've fulfilled all the TEKS that are mandated by the state so that kids will be prepared to move on to the next grade, and we're not going to skip any of those or say that we didn't have enough time to cover all of them. Step number 2, teachers compile a list of the TEKS the students are expected to learn and the time frame. So in other words, that's your scope and sequence. You're pulling those TEKS and you're looking at your incremental time frame and what will be accomplished and when. Step 3, teachers create a summative assessment that will be used to determine if students have mastered the content at the end of the given time frame. Teachers plan, step 4, teachers plan lessons including materials, strategies, that's your teaching strategies, projects, formative assessments, which is very important because formative assessments inform us on how the kids are progressing, and they also inform our reteaching component as well to help those students who need some review as they all do, and also to identify their strengths and weaknesses along the way. And your interventions. What are you doing for those students that are struggling? What components do you have in place to ensure that those kids don't get left farther behind? That will serve as a roadmap to guide students to the desired final outcome. So notice that The lesson planning is so much more than just teacher delivery of instructions for note-taking or showing a PowerPoint. It includes all those items, all of those components. They're very necessary to the whole lesson plan and the whole cycle. And finally, number 5, teachers need to review and contemplate the plan and determine if the plan will achieve the desired goals. That's where your discussion and your collaboration comes in, because even though you develop the plan, sometimes we all need to take a step back, discuss and reevaluate and find out where maybe we left a gap or something that we can add to further create a better lesson plan. So those are your steps, and as you're working on your backward design this year with your teams, you can constantly refer back to this training to make sure that you're following the steps in that order. It'll make your backward design lesson planning even more, even easier. So let's take a look at some 7th grade science TEKS using backward design. I chose the 7th grade TEKS 7A and 7B. So these are about matter and energy. The student knows that some of Earth's energy resources are available on a nearly perpetual basis, while others can be renewed over a relatively short period of time. Some energy resources, once depleted, are essentially non-renewable. Here's the student expectations. The student is expected to A, research and debate the advantages and disadvantages of using coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear power, biomass, wind, hydropower, geothermal, and solar resources, and B, design a logical plan to manage energy resources in the home, school, or community. So here you can see that these are 2 TEKS that they go together. Really, they could be taught and bundled together appropriately. It would make sense to do that. So let's say the time frame for these learning objectives is a 6 weeks period. After teachers completed steps 1 and 2, which is identifying and making a list of those TEKS of the backward design process, their 3rd step would be to create a summative assessment. And here I listed some questions that you would think about as you're designing your summative assessments. What would they look like? Would that include an essay and multiple choice, or one or the other? Perhaps you would have, instead of a paper and pencil exam, you would have teams debating each other on the advantages and disadvantages of the resources, and then proposing a plan on managing the energy resources with the PowerPoint presentation. Or with the presentation, and the presentation, how would it be scored? Would it be scored with a rubric? Probably. Would it just be by teachers, or would you have peers also evaluate each other with the same rubric as the teacher, and then take a score of the summative rubrics? And if so, what criteria would be on the rubric to evaluate the content mastery? So as you can see in this step of the summative assessment, there's actually a lot of planning and critical thinking that goes into the design process. It's not just as simple as running off a multiple choice test that you found online on natural resources. So that's one very important step, because the summative assessment is really going to tell you how the students received the information, and did they retain and process the information and be able to apply it as well. So your summative assessment is very, very important to understand content mastery. Then step 4 of the plan is there's some questions to consider in this case with these 2 specific TEKS. Number 1, are there gaps in the student's background knowledge? If there are, that will probably affect how well they're learning these 2 TEKS currently. And if so, what TEKS should have been mastered previously before 7A and B? You might have to go down to 6th grade and look at the previous TEKS that would build into these TEKS and see, are there any reteaching that you need to do before the unit gets started, that you can fill in some of those gaps and actually make the unit go more smoothly just by doing that, just by going back and seeing the previous TEKS that align with these. Number 2, will students work in groups to conduct research? What is the teacher's role? Does the teacher have more, less, or equal role with cooperative learning? What does a teacher do? Is the teacher just a facilitator? Does it change daily? These are questions you need to ask. Number 3, what sources will the students use to do their research? Will they use books or technology, possibly interviews with real professionals, maybe through Skype, or maybe they'll have a combination of all of these ideas or all of these resources. How will they present their findings? Will they present through PowerPoint? So what will their presentation of their product be? What formative assessments will there be to assess whether students are making progress towards their goals? What will that look like? Will that just be questioning? Will that be students taking short quizzes or using sentence stems to complete sentences on their thoughts as the process goes along about what they've learned? Will students have sample energy management plans to use as a model in order to create one for their home, school, or community? If students are struggling, what interventions will be provided? And number 8, how will you differentiate? That's important. Instruction for special education students, ELLs, and GT students, because all students will not learn at the same pace or at the same level of understanding. So you'll have to have these components in mind. How are you going to differentiate so that everybody can participate and learn the TEKS, but maybe according to their own interests and strengths? And number 5 is your reflection piece. That's where you're going to say, does my lesson planning have the necessary components and strategies to ensure students will reach the goals intended? And how will you know that? And this is probably one of the most important aspects of the cycle, because every time you work with backward design, you should be improving how you're going about the process. You should be looking back to the previous time you did backward design to see, how are you improving as you develop also as an educator in the process. So I'd like to say lastly, the backward design is the key to hitting your target. So I want you to keep all these things in mind. I will deliver this presentation to you so you can refer back to it, and I cannot wait to join your planning sessions and see how you're working with your new model for backward design. Thank you.